The first sign was not the snow. It was the silence. Before sunrise, Caleb Turner guided his old mule along the narrow trail that crossed the Wyoming foothills. The wind had stopped sometime during the night, leaving the world so still that even the leather straps on the saddle no longer creaked. A silence like that never stayed for long in winter. He slowed beside a small cabin standing alone against a ridge of frozen pines. Something was wrong. No smoke drifted from the chimney. The windows held no glow. Even the chickens that usually scratched around the doorway had disappeared. Caleb climbed down carefully, his boots sinking into fresh snow that reached halfway to his knees. The cold bit through the seams of his gloves before he reached the porch. He knocked once. Nothing. He knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. The door pushed inward with only a soft groan. The cabin felt colder than the air outside. Ash lay gray inside the stove. A kettle rested on top, frozen solid. One chair had tipped onto its side, as if someone had left in a hurry. Caleb swallowed and called out, "Evelyn?" Only the empty room answered. He stepped deeper inside. Each floorboard answered with a slow creak beneath his weight. The bedroom sat at the back of the cabin. The blanket still covered the bed. A lantern rested on the small table. But something else caught his eye. 2 wide floorboards beside the bed were missing. Not broken. Lifted away with care. A dark opening stared back at him. Caleb stood frozen. He had lived on the frontier for nearly 30 years. He had seen hidden food pits, secret rifle caches, even tunnels dug beneath barns, but never a bedroom built beneath another bedroom. He knelt beside the opening. Before he could speak, a calm voice drifted upward. "You can close the door, Caleb. You're letting the cold inside." His shoulders jerked. She was alive. The voice carried no panic, no desperate cry, only quiet confidence. Several moments passed before Evelyn Harper climbed slowly through the opening, one hand steadying herself against the edge of the hatch. Behind her came her 7-year-old son, Samuel, wrapped tightly inside 2 wool blankets. The boy's cheeks carried color. His hands were warm. He blinked at the daylight, as though waking from an ordinary night's sleep. Caleb stared without finding words. Evelyn simply brushed the dust from her skirt. "The storm isn't finished," she said softly. "We should feed the mule before the next wind arrives." Caleb looked once more into the hidden space beneath the floor. Stone walls, a small lantern, blankets folded neatly, shelves holding jars of beans, dried apples, smoked meat, and candles. Everything arranged with careful hands. Nothing wasted. He had come expecting to bury neighbors. Instead, he had found them waiting beneath the cabin, as though winter itself had forgotten where they were. Long before anyone understood what Evelyn had built, stories began traveling from ranch to ranch. Some claimed she had discovered an old trapper's hideout. Others insisted someone had helped her in secret. Many laughed quietly, saying no woman living alone could build something like that with her own hands. None of them knew how the idea had begun. If you've ever seen winter change someone's life forever, stay with this story. Some lessons are buried deeper than the snow itself. Only Evelyn knew the truth. It had started nearly a year earlier. Her husband, Thomas Harper, had never lived to see another spring. A falling cottonwood crushed him while clearing land beside the creek. One moment he was calling for another chain. The next, the forest had gone silent. By the end of October, Evelyn stood alone on 40 lonely acres. A small cabin, 1 horse growing old, 3 goats, a little garden already buried beneath frost, and Samuel, who still asked every evening when his father would walk through the door. She never answered right away. She simply pulled another blanket over him before adding another log to the fire. The cabin looked strong from outside. Inside, it told another story. Thin walls leaked cold through every crack. The floor stayed icy until noon. The north corner collected frost thick enough to scrape away with a knife. Every morning she discovered another place where winter had slipped inside. She packed moss into gaps, pressed clay between logs, hung old quilts across the doorway. Still, the warmth escaped faster than she could replace it. By Christmas, her woodpile had shrunk to half its size. She counted every log before carrying it indoors. Every fire became a decision. Cook supper now, or stay warm tomorrow. At night, she lay awake listening, not to wolves, not to coyotes, but to the sound of burning wood. Each crack inside the stove meant another piece of winter disappearing forever. One icy morning, she stepped outside carrying a bucket toward the well. The handle snapped from the cold. The bucket struck frozen ground. Water spread across the snow before turning to ice almost immediately. She stood there watching it harden. Then she looked across the hillside behind the cabin. Part of the slope remained bare, not green, not soft, simply untouched by the deep frost covering everything else. That small patch stayed in her thoughts the rest of the day. The next morning she walked there, carrying nothing except a shovel. She drove its blade into the earth. The top layer fought back. A few inches lower, the soil changed. It felt different. Still firm, but alive. She pressed her bare palm against the dirt. It held none of the sharp bite she expected. She stayed there for a long moment, saying nothing. When she finally stood, snow had gathered across her shoulders. Her eyes never left the hillside. That evening, Samuel noticed dirt beneath her fingernails. "Are we planting already?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "Not yet." "What are you digging?" She looked toward the bedroom floor without answering. Then she quietly reached for her husband's old measuring stick leaning beside the fireplace. Outside, the first heavy clouds of another frontier winter were already gathering over the mountains. The measuring stick stayed beside the fireplace for 3 days. Evelyn never touched it. Not because she had changed her mind, because she had learned that rushing usually meant doing the same job twice. Each evening, after Samuel drifted to sleep beneath the quilts, she sat quietly beside the stove, studying every corner of the cabin. Her eyes followed the floorboards, the walls, the chimney, the direction of the winter wind. She was not searching for comfort. She was searching for where the cold always won. By the 4th morning, she carried the measuring stick into the bedroom. She knelt beside the bed and marked 2 straight lines across the floor with a piece of charcoal. Samuel watched from the doorway. "Are you fixing the floor?" Evelyn brushed sawdust from the boards. "I'm fixing the winter." The boy looked puzzled. Then he nodded, as children often do when they trust someone more than they understand them. The first cut through the floor echoed across the empty cabin. Neighbors passing the property slowed their wagons. Few people cut holes in their own homes before winter. By sunset, 2 floorboards rested neatly against the wall. Below them lay nothing except hard earth. The real work had only begun. Every morning before daylight, Evelyn fed the goats, collected water, cooked breakfast. Then she picked up her shovel. The frozen ground refused to move easily. Each swing jarred her shoulders. Clay clung stubbornly to the blade. Sometimes she filled only 3 buckets in an hour. Still, every bucket carried outside meant another few inches deeper. Samuel helped the only way he could. He carried small stones, swept loose dirt, stacked empty buckets near the doorway. Neither of them complained. The cabin slowly filled with the steady sound of steel striking earth. People noticed. Frontier towns noticed everything. especially anything unusual. One afternoon, while buying flour at the trading post, old Frank Miller leaned against the porch railing. "I hear you're digging yourself a cellar inside the bedroom." Evelyn folded the sack beneath one arm. "I'm digging something," Frank chuckled. "You planning to hide from winter underground?" Several men nearby laughed. Evelyn simply thanked the shopkeeper and walked away. She carried the flour home without looking back. Words never filled a woodpile. They never repaired a roof. She had no time to carry them. By late summer, the hole reached nearly 5 feet deep. The air inside felt different. Outside, the August heat pressed against her face until sweat gathered beneath her collar. Inside the pit, the air stayed cool and still. Not cold. Simply steady. She climbed out slowly one afternoon and stood in the bedroom. Her eyes moved from the open pit to the stove, standing only a few feet away. Something began fitting together inside her thoughts. The next week, she traded goat cheese for flat field stones gathered from a neighboring ranch. Each stone arrived by wagon. Each one had to be carried inside by hand. Samuel insisted on helping. The stones felt enormous against his small arms. Evelyn always took the heavier end. By September, rough stone walls surrounded the underground room. She fitted every rock carefully. If one shifted even slightly, she lifted it again. Reset it. Tested it. Only when it rested firmly did she move to the next. Evenings ended with scraped knuckles, split fingertips, dust covering her sleeves. Still, each morning she returned. The room beneath the floor slowly stopped looking like a hole. It began looking like a place someone could trust. One evening, Samuel climbed down the ladder carrying a small lantern. He turned slowly, studying the stone walls. "It feels quiet." Evelyn smiled. "Listen." The boy stayed perfectly still. After a moment, he whispered, "I can't hear the wind." She nodded. "That's why we're here." She built narrow shelves into one wall, enough for dried beans, salt pork, candles, water. She tucked folded blankets inside a wooden chest. Nothing inside the room existed without a purpose. Everything earned its place. Halfway through October, she carried their bedrolls below for the first test. The hatch closed gently above them. Darkness settled around the little room. Samuel pulled the blanket higher. "Will we sleep here all winter?" "Only when we need to." The lantern burned quietly. Hours passed. The room stayed warmer than the cabin above. But another problem slowly appeared. The flame no longer danced. The air felt heavy. Breathing became slower. Evelyn sat upright. She watched the lantern carefully. Its light burned smaller than before. Not because the oil was running out, because the room itself needed something. She climbed back into the bedroom before sunrise. Cold air rushed against her face. She filled her lungs deeply. Then she looked down through the open hatch. The room had almost solved one problem. Now it had revealed another. She spent the next several days studying the cabin instead of digging. She walked around the outside walls, watched smoke rise from the chimney, held dry grass beside tiny cracks between the logs. Every movement taught her something. Late one afternoon, she climbed onto a stool beside the north wall. She smiled for the first time in weeks. The answer had been waiting there all along. She borrowed 2 lengths of clay pipe from an abandoned homestead several miles away. One carried fresh air downward. The other allowed stale air to leave naturally. She packed every gap with clay, mixed with straw, until only the narrow openings remained. The following night, she tested the room again. Samuel fell asleep within minutes. Evelyn stayed awake. She watched the lantern. This time the flame stayed bright. The strip of dry grass beside the vent moved gently. Fresh air. Just enough. She finally rested against the stone wall. The room was ready, or so she believed. Winter arrived earlier than anyone expected. The first blizzard swept across the Wyoming hills before Thanksgiving. Neighbors hurried to finish repairs. Wagons disappeared from the roads. The mountains vanished behind walls of blowing snow. One evening, Caleb Turner stopped beside her fence. "You coming into town until this passes?" Evelyn looked toward the bedroom window. "No," Caleb frowned. "This storm feels different." She glanced toward the hidden hatch beneath the floorboards. "So do I." Before dawn, the first blast of wind slammed into the cabin hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. Evelyn quietly lifted the hidden floorboards. Then, she looked at Samuel. "It's time." Snow struck the cabin with a force that sounded almost alive. Each gust rattled the windows. The roof answered with slow groans that rolled through the timbers. Evelyn lowered Samuel into the hidden room first. Then came the blankets, the food basket, 2 water jugs, a small sack of kindling. Finally, she climbed down herself and pulled the hatch closed from below. Darkness settled softly around them. Only the lantern pushed back against it. Above their heads, the storm gathered strength. The sound changed hour by hour. At first, it was only wind. Then came sharp blows against the walls, loose branches, flying ice, pieces of frozen brush carried through the air like thrown spears. Samuel wrapped both hands around the old tin cup that had belonged to his father. "Will the house stay here?" Evelyn looked toward the thick beams overhead. "It has something solid beneath it now." The boy rested his head against her shoulder. That answer seemed enough. Hours passed. The little stone room stayed almost the same. The air remained fresh. The lantern burned with a steady flame. Outside, winter seemed determined to tear the cabin apart. By the second morning, the storm had grown even stronger. Snow packed itself against every wall. The chimney stopped drawing properly. Without the underground room, smoke would have filled the cabin above. Down below, the air still moved gently through the clay pipes. Barely enough to notice, exactly enough to matter. Evelyn listened constantly, not to the wind, to the room itself. Tiny sounds told their own story. A faint whisper through the vent, the quiet settling of stone, the slow drip of moisture somewhere beyond the wall. Every sound belonged there. Nothing sounded wrong. Late that afternoon, a heavy crash shook the ground. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Samuel sat upright. "What was that?" Evelyn remained still. She counted quietly inside her head. No second crash followed. Probably part of the lean-to. Or perhaps one side of the woodshed. The cabin itself remained standing. She reached up and touched one of the heavy support beams. It had not shifted. Her hand stayed there another moment. Then she nodded to herself. The beam held firm. Night returned. The storm showed no sign of ending. Their food remained untouched except for what they truly needed. Every biscuit was divided carefully, every sip of water measured, nothing wasted. Samuel watched the lantern flicker gently. "Do you think Mr. Turner is warm?" "I hope he is." "And Mrs. Collins?" "I hope she planned ahead." The boy became quiet again. He understood enough not to ask more. On the third morning, something changed. Not inside the room, inside the air. The strip of dried grass hanging beside the upper vent stopped moving. Evelyn noticed immediately. She held the lantern closer. The flame leaned slightly, then straightened. She climbed the short ladder until her head reached the hatch. She listened. A deep weight pressed against the floor above. Snow, a great deal of it. The upper vent outside had likely disappeared beneath a drift. She climbed back down without disturbing Samuel. Then she reached into a wooden box beside the wall. Months earlier, she had prepared for problems she could not yet imagine. Inside rested a narrow iron rod, nearly 4 feet long. She climbed back up, carefully lifted the hatch only an inch. Cold air rushed through the opening. The bedroom above was completely dark. Snow pressed against the window so tightly that almost no daylight entered. She found the small opening where the vent pipe reached the wall. Then she slowly pushed the iron rod upward. Once. Twice. 3 times. Nothing. On the 4th push, the rod suddenly moved forward. A muffled rush followed. Fresh air slipped through the pipe. Back inside the underground room, the strip of dried grass began moving once again. Evelyn lowered the hatch carefully. Samuel smiled sleepily. "Did you fix it?" She nodded. "For today." That afternoon, the room grew unusually quiet. The wind outside had finally weakened. Neither of them celebrated. Frontier storms often rested before returning harder than before. They waited. By evening, the silence remained. Evelyn climbed into the bedroom. The cabin looked almost buried. Snow reached halfway up the windows. The front door would never open. She pushed gently against it anyway. It refused to move. Only white filled the narrow crack beneath it. She returned below, carrying another armful of firewood stored beside the stove. Samuel looked toward the ladder. "Can we go outside tomorrow?" Evelyn looked at the packed snow above them. "Tomorrow will decide that." The following morning brought something unexpected. Not wind, not sunlight. A slow, steady knocking. 3 careful taps. Then silence. Samuel's eyes widened. "They found us." Evelyn climbed the ladder one more time. The knocking came again, this time louder. Someone stood somewhere above the buried cabin. She placed both hands against the hatch, then looked down at her son. "Stay right here." She took one deep breath and slowly pushed the hidden floorboards open. Evelyn pushed the hatch open only a few inches. A blade of pale winter light slipped into the underground room. The knocking came again. Closer now. Steady. Patient. She climbed into the bedroom. The cold wrapped around her immediately. Every breath floated white before her face. Snow reached almost to the ceiling of the windows. The cabin looked as though the earth itself had swallowed it. "Evelyn!" A muffled voice came through the front wall. It was Caleb Turner. She crossed the room and struck the frozen door twice with the handle of her hatchet. "I'm here." For several long moments, she heard only shovels cutting through packed snow. Then, daylight burst into the cabin as the front door finally pushed inward. Snow spilled across the floor. Caleb stepped inside with another rancher close behind him. Both men stopped where they stood. The cabin was freezing. The fire had long gone out. Yet Evelyn stood before them with steady hands. She looked tired. But she was standing. Caleb glanced around the room. "No fire?" Evelyn shook her head. "We didn't stay up here." She walked quietly into the bedroom. The 2 men followed. When she lifted the hidden floorboards, warm air drifted gently into the room. Not hot, simply warmer than the frozen cabin around them. Samuel climbed the ladder carrying the old lantern. His cheeks were bright with color. He smiled at Caleb. "Mom said we'd be all right." Neither man spoke. They simply stared into the small stone room beneath the floor. Shelves still held food. Blankets remained dry. Water inside the jars had never frozen. Everything rested exactly where Evelyn had placed it months before. Caleb slowly removed his hat. "You built all this yourself?" She nodded. "A little at a time." The second rancher crouched beside the opening. His rough hands touched one of the stone walls. "It feels solid." Evelyn smiled faintly. It had to be. Outside, the storm had left the valley almost unrecognizable. Fences disappeared beneath towering drifts. Barn roofs had collapsed under the weight of snow. Several cabins stood with broken windows. Others had lost entire sections of their roofs. For nearly 2 weeks, no wagon reached town. Families survived only on what they already possessed. When the roads finally opened, people began comparing stories. One family had burned furniture after running out of firewood. Another lost nearly every chicken they owned. A ranch farther north had abandoned its cabin entirely and crowded into a neighbor's smokehouse until the weather changed. Again and again, one question returned. How had Evelyn Harper and her son come through the storm without injury? Caleb answered the same way every time. You have to see it. Within days, neighbors began visiting the cabin. Some arrived carrying fresh bread. Others brought lumber or seed for spring planting. Not as payment, as respect. Each visitor stopped in the bedroom. Each looked down through the hidden hatch. Each remained quiet for several moments. Frank Miller finally broke the silence. I laughed when I heard about this. Evelyn brushed dust from one of the stone shelves. I remember. Frank rubbed the back of his neck. I was wrong. She looked at him with a small smile. Winter corrected both of us. Word spread beyond the valley. Traveling ranchers carried the story across Wyoming. Carpenters asked permission to study the hidden room. Homesteaders copied the idea on their own claims. No two shelters looked exactly alike. Some were larger. Some used timber instead of stone. Others improved the airflow in different ways. But every family who built one remembered where the idea had started. Evelyn never claimed she had invented anything. Whenever someone praised her work, she answered with the same quiet words. The ground was always there. She simply learned to trust it. Years passed. Samuel grew into a strong young rancher. The cabin remained standing through more winters than anyone expected. The hidden room beneath the bedroom stayed exactly where it had always been. Visitors still asked to see it. Children lowered lanterns through the hatch. Older ranchers rested a hand against the stone walls before climbing back out. Many left without saying much. There was little left to explain. One cold evening, long after that famous blizzard had become another frontier story, Caleb stood outside the cabin, watching smoke rise peacefully from the chimney. He looked across the valley, where fresh snow covered every fence and hillside. Then his eyes settled on the small cabin that so many people had once doubted. It looked ordinary, almost too ordinary. No sign from outside hinted that a hidden room rested beneath its floor. Only those who had lived through that terrible winter knew the truth. Sometimes the strongest shelter was the one no one believed was worth building. If this frontier story stayed with you, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy true-to-life frontier survival stories filled with courage, practical wisdom, and unforgettable people, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and join us for the next journey into the American frontier.